Welcome to another Pokemon history lesson. Last time I discussed how the gameplay of Generation 3 differed to later generations. But there's one more big difference that I feel needs to be discussed in order to really appreciate just how special Colosseum was at the time. And that is how obtainable Pokemon worked back in Generation 3. The third generation of Pokemon began with Ruby and Sapphire, released in late 2002 in Japan and early 2003 for the rest of the world. Generation 3 added 135 new Pokemon, bringing the total number up to 386. However, only 200 of those were actually available in Ruby and Sapphire. Here, let me represent this visually. Here is a picture of all the Pokemon available in Generation 3. Now, here's how many you could actually catch in Ruby and Sapphire. That's quite a lot of missing Pokemon. While a few Pokemon were kept from Kanto, almost the entirety of the Johto Pokemon were gone. Now, this wouldn't have been so bad if it weren't for one other detail. The third generation was the first, and in fact, as of now, only Pokemon generation to not be backwards compatible with any earlier games. The reason for this was that the way that Pokemon was stored in the game's data radically changed between generations 2 and 3. But your average kid wouldn't have known this at the time. These were actually pretty dark days for the fanbase. Many people feared that these old Pokemon had been removed from the series for good. Hackers, however, knew that these Pokemon were still in the game's data, so obviously they weren't truly gone. But how would you get them? This question remained a mystery for a while, until it was answered almost exactly a year later, late 2003 for Japan, early 2004 for the rest of the world, with one game, Pokemon Colosseum. Within this game, many Johto Pokemon made their triumphant return as catchable Pokemon, to the rejoicing of many fans. Almost every Johto Pokemon that you couldn't get in Ruby and Sapphire is available in Colosseum somehow. And back then, this was a really huge deal. Colosseum was the only way to obtain most of them. And thus, for the first time, Pokemon players needed to own a different console entirely in order to complete the Pokédex. Except, wait a minute, aren't most of the Kanto Pokemon still missing? Well, Game Freak addressed that in 2004, for all regions this time, with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, remakes of the original Kanto games that featured almost all the Pokemon missing from every other installment of this gen. Now, finally, National Pokédex completion was actually possible. Then, in September 2004 for Japan, and 2005 for the rest of the world, the updated version of the Hoenn games came out, Pokemon Emerald. This game had a lot of Pokemon that were previously exclusive to either Ruby or Sapphire, however, there were still quite a few Pokemon that weren't available in Emerald at all. With all these games, version exclusivity got very confusing, so enter the sequel to Pokemon Colosseum, XD. The only exclusive Pokemon XD had was Lugia, which didn't even count for the National Pokédex back then because it was considered an event Pokemon along with Ho-Oh. But XD's lineup of obtainable Shadow Pokemon seemed to be specifically aimed at Pokédex completionists. It contained things like Kanto Safari Zone Pokemon that were very difficult to obtain in Fire Red and Leaf Green, as well as exclusives from both Ruby and Sapphire. In fact, if you combined XD with Emerald, you didn't need to own Ruby or Sapphire to complete the Gen 3 National Dex, because every Pokemon that was not in Emerald but was in either Ruby or Sapphire could be obtained in XD. So, hurting yourself in confusion yet? Gen 3 is by far the most labyrinthine, overly convoluted set of games in the entire series when it comes to obtainable Pokemon. In fact, if you wanted to complete the National Dex in Generation 3, you needed, at bare minimum, 4 games. Emerald, Leaf Green, Colosseum, and XD. This also means that you need a GameCube and a Game Boy Advance, as well as the GameCube to Game Boy Advance link cable, in order to transfer the Pokemon from the GameCube games to the Game Boy Advance ones. And you know what the most ridiculous thing about this whole setup is? You need Leaf Green for one Pokemon family. Slowpoke and Slowbro. Yeah, in Generation 3, those two are only found on Leaf Green and nowhere else. Now, as I said earlier, Ho and Lugia counted as event Pokemon in Generation 3, so they weren't needed to complete the National Dex, so technically speaking, you don't need Colosseum. Thus, you still need, well, 3 games, which doesn't make things much better. However, there is a catch. If you cut Colosseum out of the equation, you need to do 3 full playthroughs of Leaf Green in order to get all the legendary beasts. So including Colosseum still makes things a lot easier. Also, regardless of anything else, you need to do 2 full playthroughs of Emerald in order to get both Latias and Latios. And remember, Wi-Fi trading didn't exist back in this generation. You either needed to own all these games yourself, or find friends who had them, and this was at the point where it was uncool to like Pokemon, so good luck with that. Now, I never really cared about Pokedex completion in any generation, but I feel so sorry for anyone who actually went for it in Generation 3. In later gens, you tended to only need access to 2 games or so to get everything, and anything that you couldn't find, you could just Wi-Fi trade for. Gen 3 though... yeah. The point that I'm trying to make here is that to anyone watching this Colosseum series now, all of these Pokemon, these Johto Pokemon, they seem like nothing to you. But back in the day, this was a really huge deal. But there's one other facet of this that I want to draw attention to. A fact of Pokemon history that generally goes unremembered today. You might have noticed a certain something missing from the list of obtainable Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire and even Colosseum. A certain infamous universal breeder. Ditto actually wasn't available in Gen 3 for a very long time. We had to wait until the release of Fire Red and Leaf Green. This made breeding specific Pokemon much more difficult. For those who don't know, when breeding, the offspring will always be the same species as its mother. While when you breed with Ditto, the offspring will always be the non-Ditto parents. The result of this was that the lack of Ditto made female Pokemon very highly sought after in the days of Colosseum. Especially for those then Colosseum exclusive Johto Pokemon. Unless you got them as a female, you couldn't breed more of them. Because of this, Colosseum Shadow Pokemon were very highly sought after as females, and people would often reset their game, repeatedly catching the Shadow Pokemon until they got one. In fact, since some of the Colosseum Shadow Pokemon are caught fully evolved, lucking out and getting a female was the only way to obtain their base forms. This is something that annoyingly Game Freak was very much aware of, as certain Pokemon in Colosseum that have pre-evolutions that weren't meant to be obtainable until Fire Red and Leaf Green were specifically locked into always being male. Your starting Espeon and Umbreon are an example. The 2 of them are always guys because no EVs allowed before Fire Red and Leaf Green. And then Fire Red and Leaf Green came out, Ditto became available, and the entire concept of super valuable rare female Pokemon instantly evaporated. But this mythical time without Ditto is still interesting to think back on, and I hope this video has helped you understand how things were back then. People who've been playing Pokemon for as long as I have, do you have any stories from this time? Did you get any particularly rare Pokemon as females? Let me know, I'd be interested to hear. And with that, I'll end this history lesson. If you guys like this, I could do more Pokemon history lessons like this in the future. Not sure what topics that I cover, but give me some suggestions. Anyway, I'll see you next time.